All right, welcome everybody to this Zoom conference with Branko Milanović. Branko Milanović, as most of you should know, is a senior scholar at the Stone Center on Socio-economic Inequality. His recent book, Capitalism Alone, came in 2019. We're going to be talking to him for an hour, which is what this Zoom meeting should take, right? And basically, it's going to be 30 minutes of questions and conversations with him on our own, and then a Q&A in the end. Yeah. If you can, whenever you want, you can start sending questions in the chat, and our treasurer, Gregory, will be writing them down and keeping track of that. So yeah, you can do that from the very start, but you can, of course, also ask questions later on. Yeah. So I think we can start the conference.
Okay, so question. First of all, thank you very much for being here. And looking at your Twitter, it is quickly apparent that you're very well versed in its usage. How do you think the social media site can be best used to divulge economic knowledge and ideas? And do you think it's an important tool that more economists should consider investing their time into?
Yes, actually, I think it is. First, I think it's an important tool, to be quite honest, because actually I learned quite a lot about what are the new papers, what people have written, because they even, publicize their papers, so somebody else, adds the link. So I think it's an important tool, and I think it has become more important with COVID, simply because we have fewer opportunities to meet people. And in the past, it was, of course, you would learn about maybe new work or new paper at the conference, but nowadays you don't have that opportunity. Secondly, I think particularly for the young people, many of you are actually younger scholars, the fact that we had very few meetings now because of COVID further makes it really important for you to make your work known to the rest of the world, to the other people. And also, as I said before, to learn about what is being written, what is actually being studied. So I think it's really a hugely important tool.
Yeah, thank you very much. Moving to a second question. So I guess in general, right, recently we have seen some global leaders pay a little bit less attention to what economists have to say, right? You can see that, for example, in Mexico, where I come from a little bit, but also kind of across the board. So I wanted to ask, what should our profession do to regain some relevance? Or what are some topics that young scholars should think about paying more attention to?
Okay, these are difficult questions. Let me start with the second one. I believe maybe that I'm actually wrong, because obviously my view is very much determined by what I study. But I think that in general, there is a move in economics, which I think is very welcome move, towards much more empirical work and what might be called the applied work. Although I don't like that particular term, because it seems that there is some kind of very heavy duty theoretical work and then there is applied. But in reality, we know that historically the two things have gone together. In any case, the work which would use much more data would be more empirical, partly because we simply have more data today than ever before. And secondly, the technology that we have allows us to process the data much better and more quickly than in the past. So I think that would be the first point about the areas that I think would develop. I think also the area that I think is going to develop quite a lot is economic history, precisely because of the search of new data, and also because economic history very often informs our present. So it's not only that we study history for the history's sake, it's because it tells us something about now, about today. How can economists become more relevant? I think it's a very difficult topic, because economists have lost in terms of relevance, partly because of the too excessive so-called theoretical work, and then of course because of the crisis in 2007, 2008, which I think has been a big shock to many economists. So finally, to wrap it up, by going back maybe to working on relevant topics, on topics that actually matter to policymakers and to people in general, I think they can actually regain some of the influence.
Thank you very much for this answer. To the next question, since your book Capitalism Alone came out, we have had a very eventful couple of years. Yes. Is there any event that has made you reconsider any of the conclusions you reached in your book?
Yeah, it is a very good question. There is one thing that actually make me, one thing that I would like to reconsider what I wrote. This is my view about universal basic income, UBI. You know, in the book, it is really at the end of the book, and maybe there is like a page and a half on that. And I list, I think, 4 reasons why I'm skeptical. I was never against, but I was skeptical. Excuse me. And I think still that these reasons, if you read the book, I believe that they still hold. However, what I failed to see is that in an emergency situation like COVID crisis, UBI would have been extremely useful. Instead of going through the parliaments and governments and deciding to, you know, do expansionary policy and to whom to pay and to whom not to pay the money for the lost jobs and so on. If you had a UBI, you would have really what you may be called automatic stabilizer. So you would actually have an automatic disbursement and preservation of the certain acceptable level of living for everybody. So this is something where actually I think that I would, I'm not saying I was wrong, but I would certainly change the way that I presented it. And maybe for some people, and they might even ask a question on that, I don't think that I would have changed anything about what I wrote about China. So just to sort of open a possible, you know, subject for discussion.
Thank you very much. Now into our 4th question. So something very interesting that you published in the last year was talking about the Global Health Security Index that came in 2019, right? Which was an index that came very near before the pandemic, about how countries would be prepared for a pandemic, right? And you made an interesting chart in which you showed that essentially the better you ranked you were in the index, the more likely you were to have more deaths from COVID. So I wanted to ask about that, and can you talk a bit more about what the index could have failed to measure?
You know, just for those who don't know the background, in October of 2019, as it happened, Johns Hopkins University, I think the School of Public Health, and the Economist Intelligence Unit from the Economist magazine, and you know, many of course people who were, you know, asked to contribute to that, published on one of these indices. You know, we have lots of indices. I'll come to that in a minute, but they published an index on preparedness for the epidemics. And, you know, it had many components. I think probably like, you know, the book itself, you can actually download it. It's probably 300 pages and maybe like 100 components. And so they added all of this up somehow. And they came up that the countries that are actually best prepared are the United States, the UK, and the Netherlands. Now, it is clear even then, like a year ago, when I wrote that piece, that actually the US was really had quite a disastrous response to COVID. UK likewise, and the Netherlands was not particularly good. And then the countries that actually did very well in the beginning, and some of them still doing very well, like South Korea, Vietnam, for example, China, obviously, were placed very low. So my point was that that we really have to be extremely careful with these indices that actually try to rank countries, and we have seen that recently with the World Bank doing business, because they oftentimes simply confirm the public opinion, which we believe is, you know, we kind of basically generate an index to confirm what we already believe is true. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, because if that index had put, for example, Vietnam as #1, everybody would have questioned, how can Vietnam be #1? Number of doctors per capita is low, total expenditures are maybe, you know, $10 per person per year, and the US is spending like, you know, several $1,000s per year. So it would have been really questioned a lot, and yet it would have been correct. So that's why I'm actually saying I'm including, for example, the indices on corruption, transparency, governance, even democracy. I'm very skeptical of these rankings, and we have many of them, including universities, you know, ranking, and people, of course, then game the system. So they do things in order to be highly placed, which are really not reflecting what they essentially are sort of worth. So it's actually, they are just playing the system in order to be placed a little bit better.
To that, you add a little bit about the role of patience as well in your writing. And I also was interested in hearing about that a little bit. So how does patience or like cultural patience, can that play a role in COVID response?
No, this was much more speculative, so I'm not going to really, claim that I'm right on that. But I was, like everybody else, like all of us, we are actually trying to understand what happened with the pandemic, because the reaction to the pandemic varied quite a lot individually between the countries. And not only that, as you know, the pandemic first seemed to show that one set of countries have done well, then another set of countries. So it is really very difficult to wrap your head around it. But what I wanted to say is that often it seemed to me that in Western countries, people were very impatient, and I'm still impatient to end this. And actually, out of that impatience, one would not pursue strong, sometimes draconian measures to its end. Like, for example, lockdown. You would actually start with a lockdown, then you would relax because everybody would be fed up, and because the companies would not operate and people couldn't go to job. And then you would have actually another sort of outburst of the virus, and then you will have another lockdown. So you would not be again happy. So in other words, you could argue it might have been better to have the first lockdown be longer and more severely implemented, and then you would actually have a control of the virus. So I thought there was a little bit of impatience, unlike maybe in Asia that seemed to me, but anyway, this is just impressionistic, more patient and willing to tolerate certain measures that would limit your, freedom of movement or your ability to do things, which in the Western countries was really not acceptable.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. And moving on, I want to ask a bit of a broader question. What new instruments do we need to fight inequality in the 21st century?
Yes, this is a broader question. When it comes to rich countries, I do believe that we know the instruments. The question is actually whether we are willing to apply them. The instruments are not only taxation. I will just say very briefly a few things about taxation, because we should not think that everything is going to be solved only through taxes. But obviously increasing, particularly I'm talking about the United States, increasing marginal tax rates on the rich, increasing the tax rate on capital, which I think is really unacceptable that the people who actually receive income from property pay, 20% at the highest marginal tax rate, and people who work actually pay almost 40%. And then, of course, the cracking down on tax evasion and ability to use all these offshore offshore havens. So these are all obvious things. But less obvious are, I think, actually attempts to improve the public education system, which I think has been really a problem in the US probably over the last 40 or 50 years. And I don't mean only university system, but high school and elementary education. So that's actually less obvious. And another one, which I think is less obvious, is to try to deconcentrate. I know it's a difficult word, but it means to actually broaden the ownership of assets and shares, and but make more common and more advantageous from the tax purposes workers' participation in shareholding. So that would actually have the effect of cutting the link between the increase in capital income in total GDP and the increase in interpersonal inequality. So these are all the things that one could do in rich countries, and they would yield results. The question is whether there is a political will to implement them.
Thank you very much. For the next question, I think, so a lot of times also when you write about, especially, well, a lot of talks you talk about political constraint in the policy recommendations, right? Which is of course very important. Right. But I think it's also interesting to know, just to set the record straight, if you were ruling the world with an iron fist, what would your migration policy be?
That's the most difficult question, because I do try to avoid, and actually you have seen that in capitalism alone, and even in global inequality. I try to find some compromise solution. Let me try to explain my position. in principle, I'm for fully free movement of labor. I think that there is no fundamental difference in globalization between free movement of capital and free movement of labor. So this is I think we should start that with like first principle. There is no reason to ban movement of labor if you allow movement of capital. But then you have to moderate it. And I'm aware that it's not ideal. You have to moderate it because you do observe that actually people react to movements of other people from other either ethnic or religious groups or whatever differently, so that actually there is something that they are a certain percentage of the population in the receiving countries believe that their cultural specificity, uniqueness is being destroyed or undermined or whatever. So you have to find some kind of solution for them, because you cannot just simply ignore them. They could be 20, 30%, 40%, even actually maybe in some European countries even more in terms of percentage. So then I came up with this kind of a solution. I know that it's a kind of a quasi solution where you would actually have people coming and staying a limited number of years in the country of immigration, but then being obliged to go back. Now, I know many drawbacks to that, including the fact that actually that was originally the idea, for example, in Germany with the Gastarbeiter, but it didn't work out because there was no compulsory return and many people stayed. So I am actually aware that there is no really perfect solution. I think that we should start, however, as I said before, with the principle of free movement and then modify it to the extent that political conditions allow us. So that was my general principle. As I said, I'm quite open to critique on that, and I know that I was criticized, and I am in some cases quite in agreement with the critiques. It's simply that nobody can come up with really a very good solution.
Thank you very much. Going back to your book, Capitalism Alone, I think you make this are increasingly more and more likely to marry other rich people.
Sorry, there was a little bit of a cut. Could you start the question again?
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Chiara, I can hear you now, yes.
Very sorry. Okay, so you make this point about how the rich are increasingly more and more likely to marry other rich people and less likely to marry those of lower income. What do you think could be causing this trend?
This is a very good question in the sense that we see here that actually the fact that people who are very similar in education or income level marry each other arithmetically has to increase inequality. So there is no doubt about that. If you have two rich individuals marrying each other rather than marrying somebody who is less rich, inequality will increase. And there is also issue of intergenerational inequality because these people obviously have more money, have greater skills, transmit lots of advantages to children. Okay, but what is causing that? What is causing that actually is a good phenomenon, which is, I think, first, much greater participation of women in educational system, in participation in labor force, and much greater freedom of both partners to choose. And people actually have greater freedom now to choose probably than 50 years ago, and certainly more than 100 years ago. So these are actually all positive developments, but they end up by increasing inequality. So I like that example because it shows us ambiguity and the difficulty of dealing with inequality. If we believe that only bad developments lead to increased inequality, then we can actually, it seems relatively easy to be against inequality. But if there are good developments which actually lead to greater inequality, clearly we can do nothing about the underlying development. But then what we can do, we can actually try to make opportunities for the children from the rich and middle income and poor families more equitable. So, I think that was a good example, in my opinion, of the fact that even quote unquote desirable and good developments might lead to higher inequality.
Do you think that this perpetuates intergenerational inequality, and how do you think that happens?
Yeah, I do think actually that it plays, and we have seen empirical work about the perpetuation of intergenerational inequality. What we have not seen, and actually maybe that's a very good topic for research, we have not, at least I have not seen, the work which links the two. In other words, which links homogamy or assortative mating to the perpetuation of intergenerational inequality. So this is speculative, and it was in my book. I thought actually that what and there is a book by Daniel Markovich, who is actually at the in a law school at Yale. He actually has a book about meritocracy, and then he talks about that as well. The basic idea is that essentially, if you have couples, and this could be, you know, in same sex or same gender or different gender, but in any case, they who are well educated and relatively well off, they are actually able to transfer first financial advantages, that could be the housing, that could be money, and so on. Then connectivity with other people who are very similar, they transmit that to their children, and finally through the educational system. So the linkage between these two developments, two phenomena, as I said, to my extent, has not been done. But for example, there are more and more studies, as you know, about the assortative mating. Recently, only a few days ago, I saw a study for France. I've seen it for Italy. I've seen it, I think, for Spain, and probably, you know, some others, obviously the United States. So, you know, that part has been studied quite a lot. On the other hand, the part about intergenerational inequality, as you know, has also been studied, but the two have not been linked.
I'm actually very surprised that it hasn't been linked before. Before Emiliano continues with the questions, I just want to point out we have 5 minutes until we are at the halfway mark. So viewers, you can start.
Yeah, you can start putting your questions in the chat. Put it in the open chat if you want. Yeah, you can put them in the open chat.
Can I just say something to Chiara's question? It could be that I'm wrong. Maybe it was linked, but you know, it's not easy to link it because you really have to have very good longitudinal studies. And that's the difficulty. But I think it's theoretical. I think, well, theoretical in practice, actually, I think it is possible to do that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think maybe that's definitely something to consider if you're, you know, an economics student thinking about going into that area. And actually, maybe a question regarding that. So, of course, within the study of inequality, there are areas that are overexplored. But I wanted to ask you, which areas do you think remain the most underexplored?
In the work on inequality, well. Maybe the areas that I know less, so maybe I will be wrong on that. But for example, I think the area that is growing is the study of wealth inequality. You know, wealth inequality is to some extent, I have not actually worked in wealth, worked on income inequality, but wealth is actually more difficult first because the data until recently were much more sparse, and also people try to hide wealth. And I think this is the area that is still unexplored. For example, there is large accumulation of wealth, very concentrated accumulation of wealth in the United States, in China. Obviously, we know that oligarchs in Russia, wealth accumulation in countries of the Gulf region, from which we know almost nothing, like, for example, Saudi Arabia. So I think there are all these areas where we don't have enough information that can be much more can be done. And then similarly, tax evasion that until recently was not worked very. I mean, there was very little work. Gabriel Zucman, as you know, was the pioneer in that, and that has actually opened up an entirely new area. And finally, I believe that actually when it comes to global inequality, which obviously was one of my topics, much more remains to be done in several respects. For example, in respect of link between global inequality and carbon emissions. Because we know that actually, and there are some studies, but not as detailed as they could be, on the fact that it was really rich people, actually the top 10%, by income is generating about 50% of emissions. But it should be really much better documented and much better known, because if we want really to sort of argue for strong measures against climate change, we really have to address inequality. So these are, areas that I think were actually, there is lots to be done really. And so, for younger researchers, I think there is in terms of data now, there is much more that is still there possible to do.
Thank you very much. At this point, I think we'll be moving into our Q&A section. And I want to start with the first question, which was direct messaged to me by Francisco. The question there is, what do you believe will be the economic challenges for the post-COVID economy?
That's okay. Let me try. At first, I did not think that COVID would change the world so fundamentally, because I was more optimistic and I thought that actually COVID might last like 3 months or 6 months. So I thought that it would be a small blip. But now I am of the opinion that it would change in many respects, and the longer it lasts, the greater would be the change. So let me give you like 2 areas where actually it would change things. The first one is the one that we are witnessing right now. Its ability to communicate at distance and actually to do the jobs at distance. Now, the Zoom and other technologies have not been invented right now. They existed before, but they were not used massively because simply because of inertia, and we were not really forced to use them. Well, nowadays we use them, and you realize that, of course, we realize that the same job very often can be done remotely, as well as it can be done on the place, and you can actually hire labor that is much more less expensive, much cheaper abroad. So I think actually it would start mimicking the global labor market. So I think this would be a big change, and it's not a good change for the middle classes in the rich countries, because I think they would continue losing jobs to people in developing or emerging market economies. And the second change, I think, is more geopolitical, because I think the relations between the US and China became sort of irreparably damaged because of COVID. It was not only because of COVID. There are many, like in history always, there are many elements. There was the Trump election, there was issue of trade, and then COVID came. But clearly these 2 countries are going in, how should I say, in a direction which is opposite to each other. And I think it was exacerbated by COVID, and that would have effects maybe on trade. It might have effect on the transfer of technology to China and to other countries. It might affect also Chinese investments in Africa. So there will be lots of how should I say, lots of consequences of the possible new Cold War. If you look, of course, you guys are young, but people like me remember the first Cold War. It had a huge worldwide consequence, not only for the countries that were involved, but for Latin America, for Africa. So I think this one would also have that effect.
Thank you very much. Right before Chiara reads the next question, I would ask people if you can send the questions to everybody in the chat. So in general, I think it's better instead of DMing them to me, because that way it's easier for Gregory to grab them and put them in the, to organize them. But yeah.
Okay, we have a question from Thomas. How do you envision the future role of China within the world's economic order?
I would tend to see Chinese rise as I'm not sure if I should use the word unstoppable, but it's a rise which makes lots of sense given the size of the population, the history of the country, the fact that it was probably the major country in the world. Although the world was not integrated, but it was a major country in the first half of the second millennium, which means approximately from the year 1000 to year 1500. Educational level of the population and ability to absorb and to develop new technologies. That has become very apparent in the last 10 or 15 years, because if some of you might remember when you were just in high school or elsewhere, there were 10 years ago questions about China, whether China would be able to move from very low skill production like toys and and things easily, like umbrellas and stuff that China was producing, to a higher level of technology. Well, what actually happened is China actually went much further and is now really competing in some top technologies like artificial intelligence. Also, you know, it's not really written very much in American papers, but of course it's also competing in terms of space technology. You know, China had just sent several months ago a spacecraft to Mars. So, you know, that is, you know, a country without technological development cannot do that. So I think that in that sense, China will continue playing and actually would increasingly have a big role to play. And I think that reasonable attitude is actually to accept that and to try to collaborate as much as possible. And well, not as much actually, well, totally like with any other country, accepting the fact that it is a big country and it's technologically advanced country. So that's how I see China in the future. And I think the more one tries to limit the influence of China by trying to go around China, the more the situation will get bad, because it would exclude China from the international cooperation. And then China would obviously have an incentive to create alternative organizations.
Thank you very much. Next question comes from David, which is, do you see a risk of rising debt around the world, especially in Southern Asia? And what is your perception of central banking in the 21st century, considering the current inflation?
You know, this is unfortunately the question that I don't know much about, because I really don't know the exact numbers on debt. And these are really more macro issues. As you know, of course, now the fears of inflation have come up. To some extent, actually, to old-fashioned people, it seems obvious, because we have had such an incredible increase in money supply. Basically, we had it with the European Central Bank and quantitative easing, you know, 10 years ago, and then we now have it again. But obviously, it is a question for macroeconomists that would actually deal much better with it than I.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Christoph, who asks, currently, the purchase of energy resources could be seen as a great transfer of wealth from industrialized to resource-rich economies. Do you think that this rise of renewable energy resources will lead to greater country-to-country inequality and thus greater global poverty?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure why it is a what is meant by the transfer of resources, because unless what he means that the cost of production, for example, of oil, is in most countries below the market price. The reason being that actually it is like in Ricardian rent, you know, it is the last producer who actually the last producer whose production is necessary that determines the price. So all these infra-marginal producers, like for example Saudi Arabia, which can produce oil very cheaply, they do receive resources. But I don't see that as a transfer of resources, which is how should I say, non-market based. It is a market-based transfer of resources. But that transfer does create potential, you know, problems. We know that, you know, from the literature that has argued that countries with a high share of income from non-renewable resources tend to have very high inequality. Take, for example, Equatorial Guinea, which is really the extreme case. It's a very poor country, but the GDP per capita of that country is high because of exports of oil. Or take Russia also, that actually has been unable to do technologically advanced exports, partly because it depends, I think, for about almost 2/3 of its exports on oil and gas. So it does have an impact on the internal structure of those countries. But I would not say that it is a transfer of resources in the sense that it was, how should I say, exploitative or non-market based.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Tomas, and it's basically, how close are we to reaching a level of economic inequality that can severely destabilize society? Perhaps the US is most relevant he puts in parentheses.
Yes, maybe actually China as well is relevant, and I see the Chinese most recent. I had a small piece on that on my blog on Substack, and on my blog that I think the recent measures that the Chinese government has sort of started implementing against big companies, against for-profit tuition companies that actually were listed on the stock exchange, against also in favor of allowing transfer of labor from rural to urban areas. You know, hukou system is now being implemented at a provincial level, which means that many provinces have already relaxed the application of the system. All of that, it seems to me, has as the objective to reduce inequalities and power of big business, mostly in that area of high technology business and of platforms. So that seems to me also somewhat similar to what is happening with, you know, anti-monopoly actions that the US government, or actually the Department of Justice, has started against Facebook and I think Google. And so it is the realization that inequality might have actually gone past the point at which, you know, you have to do something for social cohesion. So I think that we are now maybe at the end, maybe it's an optimistic statement, but I think we are at the end of a very long period of 40 years. First, where inequality for the first 30 years of that period, from Reagan or Deng period, like 1980, for 30 years, nobody paid any attention to it, basically. Then people started talking all the time, but doing very little. So now maybe we are at the third stage where we finally will do something about inequality.
Thank you very much. Next question from Suzanne, I think a very salient question. Earlier, you mentioned that wealth inequality needs to be explored much more greatly. Do you think that the recent data leak of the Pandora Papers could contribute to that body of research?
Yes, I definitely think actually like previous leaks, because many of these many of the studies go back to different leaks. I mean, one might remember actually that Switzerland was obliged to start actually, that was not a leak, but it was that the Swiss were obliged to start publishing the data about the origin by nation, by country, of the large asset holdings in Switzerland. Then there was, I think, a big leak from Liechtenstein, maybe some 10 years ago, mostly Europeans who were trying to avoid to evade taxation in their own countries and holding money there. So yes, I do actually think that these leaks would contribute to better study, and also more importantly, even maybe to people not, how should I say, feeling so self-confident and self-assured that they could actually stash their money and that nobody will find out. Although, you know, I have to say that we have all become a little bit blasé. We don't expect anymore from our politicians and others to be honest and not to actually have offshore accounts. So when you read that Blair and his wife have avoided taxation by using a shell company in the Caribbean, I don't think that many people are surprised, because we know that Blair owns, I think, probably like 10 houses and is extremely rich, and he has consultancy jobs that bring him millions of dollars. So we have become blasé a little bit towards that.
Thank you very much. The next question comes from Aaron. He asks, when thinking about whether we should prefer a transactional foreign policy, I assume to, for example, American exceptional foreign policy, should we consider the type of policy limitations that strategy has in addressing global issues such as climate change, tax avoidance, and COVID?
Yes, of course, there are always trade-offs. Actually, why I was probably I wrote about that. Why I was in general in favor of transactional policy, which is not popular because people really prefer some level to talk about values. But the policy where you put values at the center stage necessarily leads to conflict with other countries, in this particular case, China, that hold different values. So, you know, the values should be part of interest and policy of non-governmental organizations or individuals and others. But putting values at the center stage of national policy, particularly of a big country, leads to two, I think, undesirable effects. First, the conflict with others, because it's, as I said, unavoidable. It's like in personal relations. If you have sort of an absolute value and you try to impose that value on somebody else, that somebody else will not accept it and you will be in conflict. Secondly, it leads to something which I think is very dangerous, that your own sometimes very, how should I say, imperialist intentions are being covered through the pretended use of values. So I think that it leads, the second one leads to hypocritical foreign policy. So that's why I think that your transactional foreign policy is much more open. It is not an ideal policy, but it's more open. And it might lead, as I forgot who is the name of the person who asked me the question, but it might lead to the problems that he or she mentioned, that you actually might have transactional policy that does nothing, for example, on climate change, or actually the 2 or 3 big countries agree that they should do something that nobody else agrees to. So yes, I do see that there is a danger, but I believe that the danger of a conflict and a war actually is really the primary danger that we should avoid.
Thank you. Next question from Aurora. What is your opinion about recent populist governments that have appeared all over the world and its relation with inequality?
Well, I'm not sure they have reduced inequality. If I look, for example, let me give you some, and maybe Aurora would correct me, but let me give you some examples. Actually, Trump was considered like a populist government, but he, of course, had the policy of reduction of highest tax rates. Erdogan in Turkey is considered also a populist leader. But Turkey had, and she's right in that respect, Turkey had actually a period of very high growth, and really growth that benefited the middle class in Turkey very substantially. Putin is a populist government in Russia, but in Russia there was no growth actually now over the last, I think, 7 or 8 years, or very, very moderate growth. And inequality has not changed. So I'm not, I'm very skeptical of so-called populist governments reducing inequality. They talk a lot, but they actually don't do much. And if, for example, a populist president were elected in France, I don't think that he or she, in this particular case, could do very much. It is that very often their own constituency might actually like to have higher barriers for immigration or higher barriers for trade. But on the other hand, they like certain aspects of globalization, like cheaper goods. So as I said before, you cannot have at the same time a $50 per hour jobs and super cheap, high definition TV. The two things just cannot go together. So that's why I think actually that that populist government, I don't think are really able to do very much in terms of inequality. Of course, Bolsonaro in Brazil is yet another example where although the Brazilian situation is difficult to classify, but certainly he has not done anything about inequality.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. The next question is by Francisco. The EU is aiming to transition its economy to carbon neutrality by 2050. What do you expect the effects of the transition on inequality, and what migration measures could be used to counter these effects? Mitigation efforts can be used to counter this effect, sorry.
Could you say this last sentence again, please?
So the EU is aiming to transition its economy to carbon neutrality by 2050. What do you expect to be the effects of this transition on inequality? What mitigation measures could be used to counter these effects?
This is not a question that I know much about, because obviously this is the question that has to deal with people who work with climate change. The effects, that's another unexplored relationship. The mitigation, or actually policies trying to mitigate or actually to counter the climate change, and what are their effects on inequality. I really don't know, because if you look, for example, at the Gilets jaunes movement in France, the original impetus was a kind of progressive measure that should actually be a measure to control climate change. But what was not realized that actually for many people, that was particularly in the rural and semi-urban areas, that actually meant a large increase in their costs. So that's where the beginning of the Gilets jaunes movements was. So I really don't know. That may be an area to study much more. And as for the pledges, I'm very skeptical because if you look back into the past, people have pledged, countries have pledged lots of things. And we know that these pledges are oftentimes, just pledges on a piece of paper and not much happens. So, whether they would actually achieve that, one has, whether EU would achieve that, one can be actually quite skeptical.
Thank you very much. Again, I think it's very interesting to see how, again, we have a situation in which, I guess, the relationship still hasn't been explored that much. Really goes to show how much in economics can still be researched.
Yes.
Moving on to the next question, we received a few of them, so I think I lost one. Okay, the next one from Jeremias. Do you think the promotion of property rights and formalization of informal sectors of the economy are key to reducing inequality? And if you do, how should countries try to achieve this?
Yes, I do think actually that a movement from it's a movement from the informal to formal sector actually is quite important. Now it's more easily said than done, that's a problem, particularly in Latin American countries, as you know, which is actually had lots of informal labor. It's even a greater problem in Africa, which of course depends on informal labor, but in Africa, even the possibilities to formalize that are much less, so it gets less attention than in Latin America, where actually formalization of labor has become, a feasible sort of way of addressing inequality and poverty. And I think actually in Brazil that happened during the Lula and Dilma presidencies. So it is something that I think is important because it gives people not only higher salaries, it gives them also much greater rights. Likewise, formalization of property, although it was often considered like a right-wing measure, like, in De Soto's writings, I don't think it is a right-wing measure. It is actually a measure that would enable, poor people to have some ownership, and as De Soto was arguing, also to actually use that as a collateral. So formalizations, I think in both cases are good, but when it comes to labor, I think it's not something that you can just click your fingers and say, okay, let's formalize people today, because it depends on the demand for labor and your level of development. Certainly, for example, in many African countries, it is very difficult to do that, because then you don't have the demand. Secondly, then these people would have to start paying some moderate taxation, which also and to be integrated into not only market but commercial economy actually. So it's not easily done.
Thank you very much. The next question is by Ricardo. And it says, earlier this year, there was an initiative, which actually I think was successful yesterday, I believe, to align corporate taxes globally. How do you think, or does this give you hope in kind of international coordination to mitigate inequality?
Yes, I actually think it's a very hopeful development, and it shows something that people have been saying for years, is that once the big countries, and I don't mean only the United States, but I mean really big countries in Europe that are losing lots of money because of ability of large companies to play one against another. And of course, as we know, the case of Ireland was the most dramatic one. Once they really realize that they are losing lots of money that otherwise they would have received through taxes, corporate taxation in this particular case, they can crack down on that, and I believe likewise, once they realize they are losing so much money through personal evasion of taxation, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, and of course in the past the UK when it was in the European Union, can crack down on that. So this is not the issue of power, but it's actually the issue of willingness to use that power. And why they were unwilling to use that power was because of the lobbyists within. So if you have companies that are able to lobby as they are actually obviously lobbying in the United States. For example, I know I recently saw that that Amazon, from being a company with very few lobbyists, now is a company with the most number of lobbyists in Washington. Then, of course, they make sure that the countries, the governments, don't do anything. But once you break this lobbyist power, then of course the nation states are still quite powerful.
Thank you very much. Another question from Aaron. He asks, how would you explain the difference in the change for the welfare of the middle class in Turkey and Russia, despite both having populist leaders?
I think, let me put it like that. For Turkey had a remarkably good period in the first, I would say, possibly 10 years of Erdogan, because he has a market-friendly policies towards small-scale enterprises and middle class. And when I say that, I actually have in mind in particular, and I've looked actually at the Turkish household survey data, it actually shows very clearly. These were not the policies that were benefiting people in big urban centers. And actually we know that people in big urban centers are anti-Erdogan, like in Istanbul and Ankara, Izmir, and so on. But they actually benefited people with small businesses in the hardcore of, like Anatolian central part of Turkey. And that shows, as I said, in household survey data with actually very high rates of growth of the Turkish middle class. Well, then the economic situation became worse. Then you had large inflow of immigrants in Turkey as well. Then the world economy after 2008 decelerated, and also Erdogan engaged in more sort of adventuresome policies in Syria and elsewhere. So I think then actually the growth rate in Turkey declined, but certainly it had a appeal for the middle class, sort of business-oriented middle class in Turkey. The Putin situation is different because, of course, he benefited from large increases in oil prices and from, which is not mentioned very often, but from introducing some order in Russia, because when he came to power, really, basically, the country was almost on the edge of the civil war. So, the middle class in Russia did extremely well for a while, like in Turkey, but then, Russia was unable to really move into the higher value added production. The same thing that we mentioned for China, that China has been able to do that and Russia has not. So I think this is a major problem that that Russia, not only the Putin government, but whoever comes next is going to face the problem.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one quick last question.
Yes.
So the next one is by Sanya, and he asked, how pertinent is the existence of the informal sector for the growth of an economy?
Well, as I was saying before, I think that if, everything else being the same, obviously you prefer formalization for many reasons. Not the least one is the ability of workers either to organize or to have certain rights. Even if they're not able to organize, they actually do have certain rights, which they lack when they're in an informal sector. But the formalization is not an easy task, because formalization essentially means the transformation of the economy and the development. So one cannot just sort of wish formalization. It comes as the result of producing more value, as I was saying before, value-added production and having higher productivity. And then formalization comes from the demand for new labor. So we could formalize something on paper tomorrow, for example, take poorer countries like Tanzania or Zambia, but it would have no effect on it, on what's happening on the ground. So yes, I believe it is very important, but I think it's a part of the development process. It cannot be just taken out by itself.
Thank you very much, Branko, for everything today. It was super important for us, and we were very happy to be able to talk to you. I thought it was really interesting.
Thank you very much, Emiliano. And I think Emiliano and Chiara, I think you were at least the people that I've seen inviting me. And thanks to everybody for joining at this, not maybe the most convenient time on a Saturday evening. And I wish you a very nice evening, tonight, a nice weekend. And thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.